Alright guys, we're going to do some more Algebra 2 review, and now what we're going to look at is how to solve polynomial inequalities. So if you think about an inequality, alright, we're trying to find where something is greater than or less than a certain number. Now, what's going to be the easiest is when we're looking at these values in terms of being greater than or less than 0. Because if you think about it, the only kind of numbers that are less than 0 are negative numbers. So if we can determine where this function is going to be negative, it's going to be easy to tell where it can fit this inequality. So what we're going to do is anytime we have a quadratic equation, we want to set it equal to 0 and factor it. Because if you think about a graph, the only way the graph can go from positive to negative is to cross through 0. And the only way to go from negative to positive is by crossing through 0. So what we're going to do basically is find our boundaries where our graph can switch between negative and positive. So what we're going to do first is just find our zeros. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is figure out the possible zeros. I'm going to factor this graph, so I need two numbers that multiply to negative 12 and add up to negative 4. And those two numbers are going to be a negative 6 and a negative 2, or a positive 2. And because that number in front is 1, I don't really need to go through any of that extra process here. So this is how my equation factors. That means that this graph is going to have zeros at 6 and negative 2. So I want to go ahead and plot those points on a number line. So I have negative 2 and I have 6. So that means this graph, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to look at it makes three different sections here. I've got this section to the left of negative 2, the section in the middle, and the section that's greater than 6. So the way I'm going to do this first is I'm going to pick any number that's over here to the left of negative 2. It doesn't matter what number. So let's say I pick a negative 3. I don't need to know exactly what this is going to work out to. All I need to know is that if I plug in negative 3, is that going to give me a positive number or a negative number? So if I plug in negative 3, I'm going to get a negative over here times a negative over here. And you guys know a negative times a negative has to equal a positive. So if I plug in negative 3, I'm going to get a positive number over here. So that means that my graph, no matter where I am to the left of negative 2, is going to be positive. There's no way for this graph to switch to negative unless I had another 0 to go across. So that means every number to the left of negative 2 is going to be positive. So now we're going to pick a new section. Okay, we're going to do this middle section. So I'm going to pick any number in that middle section. Preferably one that's going to be a little easy to figure out. So the number I'm going to pick is 0. So if I pick 0 and I plug that in, I'm going to get a negative number times a positive number. And a negative times a positive is always going to be a negative. So that means every number in between negative 2 and 6 is going to be negative. So last, we're going to look at that last section. So any number to the right of 6. So let's say I pick 8. If I plug in an 8, I'm going to get a positive number in that fraction, or in that parenthesis, and a positive number in that parenthesis. A positive times a positive is always a positive. So that means every number to the right here is going to be positive. This actually would help you also if you were drawing a graph. If you think about this, if I were to go through and make my graph here, I'm going to have a positive, I'm going to cross through there, and I'm going to have positive and cross through there. Now if you think about your graph here, this original equation is even and positive. I have the right end behavior to follow that, and my graph touches at 6 and negative 2. And that's exactly what this does. So this sign chart kind of helps us also that same way. So once you have this sign chart filled in, you don't need to draw the graph. That's just to kind of help you guys see, again, where that comes from. What we're looking for to solve our equation is when my values are less than or equal to 0. And those values is everywhere my graph is negative. So that is going to be everywhere from negative 6 to negative 2. And the way we're going to write this, we're going to use interval notation. And that's the solution to my inequality. Alright, so we're going to do the same thing for these last two here. Alright, the first thing you have to remember to do though, whenever we factor and whenever we're trying to solve this, the first thing we need to do is make sure we set this equation equal to 0. So first I need to rewrite this and set it equal to 0. And now I can factor. And after I factor, I'm going to find my zeros. My zeros are negative 2 and 1. And then I'm just going to look at all those sections that I have here and go section by section. So if I pick any number to the left of negative 2, let's say I take a negative 17. If I plug in a negative 17, I'm going to get a negative number times a negative number, which always works out to be positive. So my graph is going to be positive. Alright, so now I'm going to pick a number in this middle section. Again, easiest number there is probably 0. If I plug in 0, I'm going to get a positive number times a negative number, which always works out to be negative. So my graph is going to be negative in between 2 and 1. And the last one, that last section is to the right of 1. To the right of 1, I plug in 12. That's going to give me a positive number times a positive number, which always works out to be positive. So this graph is positive to the left of negative 2 and to the right of 1, and negative in between negative 2 and 1. So what that means is I go back to my original question. I'm looking for where this graph is greater than 0. So that means I'm looking for positive values, not including them. So that means I'm not going to include negative 2, but it's going to be everywhere to that side of it. And I'm not going to include 1, but it's going to be everything from that side over. So writing this in interval notation, this graph would be from negative infinity to negative 2, and also from 1 to infinity. Alright, so my last graph here, let's go ahead and go through this one. It's already set equal to 0, so the first thing I need to do is just factor it. So the first way to factor, remember, you always take your greatest common factor out first. And then I can factor that inside part. That's going to factor into x minus 1 times x minus 1. So my zeros here, there's still only 2 zeros. One of my zeros is actually 0, and the other 0 is 1. So again, I still have 3 sections here I need to look at. So the first section is going to be everything to the left of 0. So it's going to be all of any negative number I plug into this equation. So if I plug in a negative number, that would be a negative times a negative times a negative. So 3 negatives multiplied together will be a negative number. Now let's go to this middle section, something like 1/2. If I plug in 1/2, that's going to be a positive times a negative times a negative, which is all going to work out to be positive. And then the last section, any number bigger than 1. Let's say we plug in 4. That's going to be a positive number times a positive number times a positive number, which will all multiply together be positive. So now I go back to my original equation. I need to know everywhere this graph is less than or equal to 0. So I'm looking for negative numbers. So part of my solution is going to be from 0 over. So part of my solution will be everywhere from negative infinity to 0, including 0 because it's less than or equal to. But also, this one is a little tricky. This graph tells me everywhere it's less than or equal to 0. Now, although this middle section, everywhere greater than 0, is positive, at 1, that graph actually is equal to 0. So I do also need to include the actual number 1. It's a little tricky on that one. But the biggest thing here, guys, is just factor, find your zeros, and then look at those ranges. Okay? And you don't need to know the exact number, you just need to know, is that going to be a positive number or is that going to be a negative number? And that's how you do a sign chart.